Hey everyone, welcome back to the Miss Education Podcast. This is your host Victoria, and on this podcast, we talk all things education, meaning schools, school systems, teaching communities, and a place where we get to dissect challenges, futuristic ideas, and other social justice matters. Today, I want to introduce our guest, Jaiman, who characteristically goes by his last name to most people. He's a musician, a teacher, a community organizer, and currently working at a leadership development consulting company as a senior associate. The work Jaiman does has spanned across continents. As ages, he's taught as a classroom teacher in both India and the US, from pre-K to high school. His current educational endeavors entails adult education and takes him to Southeast Asia and the Middle East most recently for work travel. So thank you, Jaiman, for joining us on this podcast.
So glad to be here.
So in this episode today, we're going to be talking about teaching practices, careers, and beyond. We have a two-part series. We're on part one right now. And for the first part, we're really going to focus in on what do you learn about yourself and others as a teacher in different contexts. So at least for me, right, we're both teachers. For me, and why I became a teacher is because my dad was a teacher. And so I saw educators in my family. My aunt was an early childhood educator. My uncle was a teacher. And so I feel like I just saw a lot of people who liked their career, lived good lives, and were in education. So I chose the path of education when I was in high school. And I mean, right now I'm currently not a teacher, but I really did enjoy it. I really loved doing teaching. But what about you? What made you want to become a teacher?
That's so great. I didn't know so many of those things about you. Like your dad was an educator.
Still,
Still, oh, lovely. Um,
or in the education space?
right. And that's similar to me, just in the education space. I love that. Maybe later we'll talk about the broader definition of teaching and education. But just to answer your question about what made me want to become a teacher, it's a great question. Um, the thing is, I think I always wanted to be a musician. I always wanted to be a composer. Um, I would say that in my soul, I'm a musician, and at heart, I'm a teacher. And that can whoever you are listening to this, interpret that whichever way you want to.
Yeah.
But really, where my interest in education and teaching was really rooted in creating as a musician and as a composer. And when I was doing my undergrad, there was this kind of pivotal moment where where the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened.
Yeah.
And I think in my heart, I knew there was something I wanted to do that was not only as a composer. Like I wouldn't be happy in my life if I did it, but I didn't know what that was exactly. And then when I kind of encountered that pivotal event in my life, I remember I'd skipped class that entire day, and I was like, "What is the effing point?"
Yeah.
Like that's really, and it was a highly emotional reaction. There's definitely a point for music and for art, but it was like really, if I was being honest with myself, I was asking myself that question, not just merely of the world. What is the point of art? And so I kind of combined that with this connection I had in India at this beautiful NGO called Music Basti, and wanted to essentially combine together several different parts of me and explore education and explore the arts through those different parts of me. So, for example, going to India, I was really interested in my identity as an Indian. And born in the US, I'm Indian American, but I'd always gone to India almost 3 months out of a year growing up. So I'd almost felt like I had a second home. One-fourth of my childhood was in India. And I wanted to really understand and explore my culture just a little bit more directly. Just me and the culture, me and the India versus not necessarily being safe with my family, kind of like going deeply
Right.
into it. I think part of it was also I wanted to reckon with my privilege.
Yeah.
Growing up and seeing kind of contrasting a very safe suburban, life in Massachusetts
Yeah.
to seeing a country that was not so recently ravaged by colonialism and is still highly dealing with the effects of that, and to see like thriving lives, living alongside lives that are not even meeting their own basic needs for
Right.
food, for love,
Right.
for sustenance. And I think all of that kind of came together alongside my desire to explore music in a different cultural context, to kind of be like, I'm going to teach at this NGO in India. And it was basically teaching music to kids who come below the poverty threshold in New Delhi. Um, and for me, it was really my first confrontation with what was initially my fear of poverty, my fear of the marginalized people in our society. And I mean, really, what I discovered was that I kind of had it completely the other way around. There is a lot of suffering, and there is a lot of there's a life that I have never experienced, and people just speaking maybe on poverty alone. But I also discovered, very surprisingly, how there's actually this wealth of resilience in these communities I had never fully even seen in my own communities. There was an astounding amount of love, and an astounding amount of, as I said, like this resilience to keep on going. And it was wonderful for me. It really kind of cascaded. I could go into deep detail, but I think from there, that really was my pivotal kind of moment and journey into wanting to become an educator. And since then, my concept of education has grown from music education to, I guess, right now, it's more leadership development and like collective building, collective leadership building. Um, and there's been certainly a journey from there, but really
Yeah.
that's where my heart is in the whole teaching journey I've gone through.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I also wanted to pick up on when you said, or I'll paraphrase, you said you're scared of marginalized people or the people who you may see on the streets, poverty. And there's also something to say about when you go back to your parents or your home country and see people that look just like you and think, could this be me? Right? This could be my life. Why am I special to be born in Canada or the US to not be the one who walks with no shoes in the
Yeah.
streets, right? And so kind of like that it's kind of trippy when
Yeah,
you go and visit and you're like, wait, oh, this is the world, right? Like these are my people. So I think there's something to be said about that as well.
so true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you were teaching in India, what age were you teaching? Were you doing high school or were you doing elementary school?
I was lucky in India to have taught pre-K through 12. So
Oh wow.
I got the entire like youth education,
Okay.
the span of the youth.
Right.
But I'll just so like just to know more specifically, I taught for 2 years in India, and the first year I taught primarily. It was like, I guess in the U.S. it would be ages. Just thinking about grades, so it would probably
Right.
be ages 5 through 11, 12. And then the second year I taught in a village in the south, this really beautiful school called Shanti Bhavan, and there it was all the ages, and I was a big focus on middle school and high school.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And what did you teach? You taught music there or did you do other subjects?
So I taught music in both places, at
Got
Shanti
it.
Bhavan and at Music Basti. Um, I would say that my curriculum changed the second time I went to Shanti Bhavan. I think before, the music curriculum I was teaching was teaching music and teaching music performance, and then emerging through that are like these conversations around like collaboration and social skill building, and like what does it mean to have discipline and work on practicing, and what does it mean to like work together with someone and put down some of your own visions and compromise on some of the things that you might want to bring or you really want to push. The second year, it kind of started to build out more into using music as a bridge into seeing a little bit around like the inequities in the world. I would say it was in a
Right.
pretty like haphazard state then. I was kind of
Right.
beginning to grow my curriculum, but
Right.
wasn't just music and social skills. It was starting to go into my later curriculums, which I use in the U.S., which are around more around arts and activism.
Right. Right. And in music here, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but music in Canada, sometimes music teachers and music class, they kind of have it hard, the teachers, because the kids are throwing papers in the air. They're like, whatever, it's music. Like, I'm not, paying attention, being the keener front row. Um, in India, was it the same where you were kind of like, okay, I know it's music class, but this is serious. Like you said, like you're going to learn social skills. You're going to learn to collaborate with people and give up your desires for the song that you wanted to do. Or do they have a different respect for music there?
That's such an excellent question, because I experienced that big difference going back to the U.S. kind
Okay.
of the
Yeah, tell us
situation
about it.
describing. Yeah, but initially in India though, like I didn't find that to be the case. I found that like music was it might have been the nature of the classrooms I was teaching in. One was a Teach for India classroom that my NGO was collaborating with, and another was in this little classroom that was in this area called Gurgaon, and it just felt. I guess my overarching sense was that like, wow, like I get to learn music, and like all those songs I've heard on the radio, like
Right.
they're I can learn them and I can sing them. There's an excitement. I would say that when I got back to the U.S., I kind of actually encountered a lot more students who were really, really fed up with the institution of schooling itself and didn't
Right.
respond to the way that I think my later issues surround a lot more around school culture and the way that we engage students, the way we discipline, the way that we classroom manage, and
Right.
that's the time in which like it was like, oh yeah, music class is my space to kind of throw everything's up in the air.
Right.
Though I really struggled that first year coming back. I was teaching in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I started making sense of that and actually leaning into that sort of
Right.
fact that music is kind of a cool space where you can throw your shit in the air and you can have fun and like
Right.
screw like the institutional bounds of where we are, where we have to sit and behave and do everything. Like let's also like mess things up a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I love that. And it also wasn't sometimes the best. Sometimes it meant like kids would have maybe too much fun and kind of not even want to learn, you know?
Right.
Um, it was a balance I was having between creating like what I believe are really like strong standards of learning and also
Mhm.
creating a space that was outside of the institutional space that I felt the majority of my students were highly distrusting of and
Right.
cultivating something else, cultivating a classroom that was almost just like, you know, for me in my mind, it was like a little Narnia they could walk into, once you
Right.
open that door.
Right.
Um, yeah.
You and the cultural references. You really know your movies and stuff.
I'm a man of culture.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because you're saying that now you want to create this Narnia for the students. And it's kind of sounds like you're now, or now as in then, learning about yourself as a teacher, that you are the kind of teacher or person who will create space for people to escape maybe the realities of the world or the realities of institutions like education that might be oppressive in ways that they can
Mm.
actually just relax and be free. Do you feel like, teaching in India, coming back teaching in the US, what were those takeaways of what did you learn about yourself as a teacher, right? Like, what did you
Mm.
real? Who were you as a teacher as opposed to who you are now as a non-classroom teacher?
Right. I love that distinction. Not as a teacher, as a non-classroom teacher.
Yeah, yeah,
um, that's like really good question. I think like some of the things that I learned was it was highly internal and it was also extremely external. I would say the internal was really a little bit around like how much can I cope with really the hardships of these like extremely hurting and someone would call like completely failing institutions of education.
right,
Speaking about the U.S. context, I wouldn't say I know enough about the Indian context, but I'll say specifically for the U.S. one. I just to be specific, I taught in when I came to the U.S. in schools in the outer boroughs of New York City, so Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. The NGO at NGO, what's the word we use here? NGO, nonprofit.
yes. I NGO made a lot of sense to me, and
Right,
then I was like, what word could he be looking for?
right, right. For people who don't know, right, NGO is non-government organization, and
Yes,
nonprofit is a
yeah,
nonprofit.
yeah,
Um, but when I taught like through the nonprofit at these various schools, um, I think I found that like more internally, I had to learn around like what it means to hold my identity and my various identities. I think in particular, my identity as a younger teacher, my identity as like a light skinned Indian man, my identity as like an American person who comes from, a middle class upbringing, socioeconomic upbringing, my identity as, as a proudly feminine but yet also like a straight man,
Right.
and cisgender male.
Right.
I think, and that's important considering many of the contexts I was teaching in are like are dealing with those are dealing with some of those issues around gender and around race and
Right.
around and most of the people I taught with basically come from like historically segregated neighborhoods. So they're mostly black and brown. Primarily, a lot of I would say the biggest populations I taught were like immigrant Caribbean um,
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
And I think I had to learn a little bit about like what it means to hold my identities, but also be able to kind of reach out through it, not to become boxed in my identity. You know,
Yeah.
like I can relate as a person of color to a certain degree with a black student, a middle schooler in the Bronx, in deep Bronx. But I also can't in many other ways. So there's a level of me having to be curious and open with the students, and there's also a level of me like just kind of talking from my own experiences, being like projected upon and experiencing my own, like more, I would say as an Asian American, a little bit more subtle examples of like racism
Mm.
growing up.
Right.
So a lot of kind of like examining myself at the end of like really tired days. And I think externally, just getting to that point, I learned a lot about just the system we exist in. You know,
Yeah.
I I thought of racism and poverty and etc. as highly individual. That like
Mm.
people are born that way, that they're born into these circumstances, and it's really hard for them to get out of it. And that like in many ways, like you know, are these people who are from these backgrounds? Like what is the root of it? I didn't fully understand that. And I think I began to see it more systemically afterwards. I began to see how like through generations we carry these kind of overarching systems of just ways of interacting with it, which affects the ways we interact with society. And part of that interaction with society is going to school and interacting with that
Right.
institution. So, and I think it was both painful and powerful for me. It kind of came together, I guess, in like 2020
Mm.
with BLM. It was
Hmm.
I had experienced and seen firsthand systemic racism and seen it institutionally, particularly in schools. Um, but I think my actual awakening to why our system of capitalism and our systems of white supremacy, etc., actually are like systemically have these holes and like just speaking for example for US society, that was my awakening in
Right.
2020 with BLM.
Right. Yeah, and it's clear that the different um, areas and the different contexts that you're teaching in clearly have different outcomes, different takeaways. They change who you are as a person, right, for the better. Um, and these different types of practices, right, like when you're teaching kindergarten students, sometimes you have these really great takeaways that you probably thought you'd never have. Some people think, oh, I teach kindergarten, it's going to be easy breezy. They're 5 years old,
Mm,
what do they know about the world? But I remember when I was teaching kindergarten, I was in grade 11, so I was doing a co op experience for doing student teaching for kindergarten. And I had one of the students come up to me and she said, so her mom was Chinese and her dad is Iranian Persian. And she was like, so my mom's skin is this color and she speaks this language. And my dad's skin is this color and he speaks this language. And she's like, what language do you speak? And I was like,
wow.
oh, and that was such a deep question for a
Yeah.
5 year old. I was like, whoa. Because she was doing so many things, right? She's analyzing, she's doing, oh, so skin color means different language. Like, which language do you speak? Although clearly we're both speaking English to each other, but she
Mm.
still was like, maybe you speak another language because I noticed these people in my life who have looked different and then they have different languages. Which one's yours? And I was like, I only speak English, but I understand that other people who have my skin color may have other languages. Um, And so it was really like that kind of analytical thought where I'm like, oh, kids know their identities, or at least they're really trying to know their identities, um, even
Yeah.
at the age of junior or senior kindergarten. And so even for me as a teacher, it's like what's implied for me as a learner teacher when I'm doing kindergarten is different than when I teach grade 11, 12, right? Grade 11, 12, they're not asking those questions, but they're asking totally different questions where I'm like, oh, I didn't expect that. And then I
Mhm.
have to confront things about myself as well, right?
Right.
In totally different contexts and different implications as a woman who's a teacher, right? Like all the identities that keep coming into play as I hear things, as I see things. I'm like, okay, now go home, reflect, think about it without having it overtake my day or my whole life, but just how can I reflect? How can I be better tomorrow? So I feel like those different teaching practices, they always have different implications based on the context, right? The age, the
Yeah,
culture. Yeah.
that's so true. What a beautiful story. Wow.
Yeah, she was great.
I'm just so in touch with, I don't know, like me and you have had experiences and learning together, right, around just so many different philosophies and education and
Yeah.
equity and justice work. And I just remember this one of the things that we learned was like around Paulo Freire, right, and around his
Yeah.
idea of like around that we're not necessarily what the banking receptacles or whatever it
Right.
was. Like we're not banking information
Yeah.
into people. And I don't know, I kind of had this thought while walking the other day, and it's just we often think as educators we're planting seeds into youth,
Hmm.
particularly the youngest ones, as you're talking about, the
Yeah.
kindergartens and preschoolers. But I think honestly, like the seeds are already there.
Yeah.
It's our work to really water them,
Yeah.
and provide sustenance to the seeds, which are essentially, I think, curiosity, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just like the curiosity to know about the world, about space, about, like about math around this. And maybe some students have some preferences for this or that. It's just like, can we just water those seeds so that curiosity is constantly nourished even until adulthood and hopefully just
Yes.
throughout our lives?
Yes. That sounds a lot like, oh, I'm blanking on the like the Montessori schools or the play-based learning
Mhm.
for younger children. That sounds a lot like those theories because I think they do play on watering the seed and the curiosity. And some
Right.
people are fearful because they're like, but if you don't have a list of what you're going to tell them, how will they learn? Right? I think a lot of people have that fear if there's no curriculum, or I mean, there is a curriculum for Montessori schools, but people think if you're not going in saying, okay, we are for sure today learning about this, right? But if the kid's like, hey, I actually want to explore this tree, you're like, okay, and you follow them and you kind of have that moment where you'll still get to the
Mm,
points or the curriculum uh, goals that you have, but you're following them. Like they're curious about the world. And as teachers, sometimes we take on all of the roles, right? Like we are parent, we are social worker, we are therapist, and it's like, we can't do all of that. Their parents, their family, they have given them the seeds and they come to school, they're interacting with other people, which is great. And then, yeah, we're watering, we're giving them
yeah.
curiosity questions to kind of see what they want to learn.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I think I'm just being in touch with like the idea of like I wish that actually I had the opportunity to teach at a Montessori school.
Mm, me
I've only
too.
done some right, right. I've only done some research about it. I know so little, but like part of me just thinks a little bit about how we separate subjects so much in our society. There's math, there's science, there's art, there's English, etc. And like and they are just distinct. Of course, these like disciplines and these practices are distinct in so many ways, but also like maybe like they are more related than we think. Like
Yeah.
if we explore a child's curiosity to go to a tree, there's so much that can come out of that. Like if we allow some of what we want to bring curriculum wise and content wise to that curiosity. Like a tree is, if you want to learn about biology, that's the structure of a tree. If you want to learn about sound, can we listen to like the music? It's the music of the rustling of a tree's leaves. You learn about math, like or physics. I don't know. You can think about like
Like the
New-
circumference of the tree, or you're going
right,
to put a poster up, like what's the dimensions?
totally. Or like Newton's like the whole thing that he fell on his head and
Yeah,
about gravity. There's just like
exactly.
or what exactly? There's like things that we can relate, and I think we can just balance. It's not about like having something that's so purely built on curiosity that they can do whatever the
Yeah.
heck they want.
Yeah.
There's guidance alongside us kind of centralizing curiosity, that seed of curiosity.
Hmm.
That's my sense. Once I go into a classroom, I'm sure the practice itself is not that simple. But like
Right.
I can say, at least from my experience of kind of trying to sow curiosity, maybe not in a Montessori kind of, you know, habitat, but I can at
Yeah.
least say that that's a beautiful way to approach it, to actually break down the barriers of these things that we divide so nicely into subjects, you know.
Yeah. That reminds me of one of my friends who's older. She said that so she has three kids, and there's a big age gap between the first one and the last one. The last one is four, three, I think three, and
Mhm.
then the her oldest is 22. And she said that her two kids, the one who's like 22 and 15, she's like, admittedly, my kids are a bit strange. Like they're just like strange humans. Like I love them. They're my soul guides. But then she said that when they went to kindergarten, they totally changed. And like they kind of were subdued. They were just very much only do anything to fit into the crowd. They didn't really want to explore anymore. And then with her last child, she actually didn't put him in kindergarten. She's like, I don't even want to do that anymore because they're going to change. Like they're going to be reprimanded for doing what they think is interesting. Or she's like,
Mhm.
especially when you're a person of color, she's like, they're going to tell me that my child has all these things when they just don't want to explore that right now. Right. And so she's
Right.
like, I don't want to have slapping diagnoses when I know my kids. And they're admittedly a bit strange, and that's okay. And I will do that with them at home. They're still going to go to school, but she's just like, maybe the first years, the formative, like those early childhood, I'll do a program at home. We'll explore the forest nearby, and that's her program. And I totally understand that because
Right.
school is also, again, the nature of it, because there's 30 kids in a classroom. You have to be line up, go this way. Why aren't you in line? Why don't you hold this person's hand? And it's like, even for 4 year olds, right? It's a lot to deal with, and it's a lot to kind of like, it's good for self control, it's good for developing those skills. And at the same time, there is a bit of an agenda that may not benefit everyone.
Yeah. A little bit of an agenda is a huge agenda, right? So true. And
Yeah.
like and some schools will be a part of that agenda, and some other schools like might push on that agenda. I don't know. I have found, for example, I've been lucky to go to in my middle school. I went to a pretty affluent middle school in Concord, Massachusetts, and there I found that the agenda, in fact, that's kind of we having a kind of like a there's a tone behind the word agenda, but really,
Yeah, right.
and I guess at least the societal agenda of a school like that is really to, in my opinion, to like cultivate the skills of the executive class in our society.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, how to like manage people more, how to deal with like more unknown situations, personal responsibility. The title of my school, our slogan was "Sua Sponte," which means it's in your hands. So
Mm,
constantly, the school was telling us about personal responsibility around like thinking creatively with the content we're being taught.
right.
And then like I've also now, as I said before, taught in schools in the Bronx, and I've seen the other classrooms and seen how so much of the curriculum revolves around being right or wrong, and not about like
Right.
around like discussing perhaps the in betweens of like many of these answers, or being critical. You know, critical mindsets, things like thinking more creatively. That's not the agenda there. It's to
Mm-hmm.
produce more of like the people who can be docile and accept, the working class needs of our
Right.
society. And like
Right.
ideally we want both. We need to also have people who can like do like what we need of working class needs in society, and we need people who can be creatively thinking. And why can't every person be both, essentially? Or why can't
Yeah.
they make the choice to be either? That's the thing. It's just our
Yes.
agenda for black and white students is this, my agenda for, excuse me, black and brown students is this, even working class white students too. Just huge distinction that's important to say.
Yeah.
And that's agenda that's here, that's different. So it's hard to break. It's hard, really, systemically, to break out of that.
Yeah.
It's so challenging.
Yeah, and I guess the idea is that should you, quote unquote, be so lucky to go to that school where you're being prepared to be an executive, you have those critical thinking skills, that's when you start to see, like, your eyes are open and you're like, oh, who's around me? Who's not around me? Where are the people that look like me? What skills do I get? And then you compare yourself to people from other schools that you may meet who are your age, who went to the school down the street, and you're like, oh, we have different
Mm.
priorities, different skills, different. They're not even going to your school. Like the universities I'm going to didn't even do the talk at your school, right? Like those are the kind of things you start to notice in that separation, right?
Right. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So true.
I also wanted to, because in our pre-chat we talked about this idea of where are your roots as a teacher, and I wanted to end our part one with asking you where are your roots as a teacher,
Mm.
and what does that mean to you?
Mm. Yeah. This is one of those like really great questions that I like feel like I would answer so differently each time.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of the question that's a little bit like my roots as a teacher are like in my soul as a musician, as a creative person. Or like my roots as a teacher are in, my like extremely distressing and eye-opening experiences in youth of being confronted outside a safe window with extreme poverty,
Yeah.
you know? But I think also now, like reached a point in my career that my roots are from my experiences in education and teaching. So like I find now, like I right now, as you mentioned before, I do adult. I the way I see it is I do adult education. You
Right.
can call it being a leadership consultant, or you can call it being, whatever different terms that people have. But ultimately, I'm doing adult education right now, and I'm finding like I need to go back to my roots more than ever. Because like, and I find like the ways that I do that are I remember, like that I remember my students. I have a practice before I facilitate in front of a group of adults, whether it's a group of teachers, a group of government officials, or what so many different sort of groups we're teaching. That I go and I listen to Kendrick Lamar. I go back and I because my students recommended me Kendrick Lamar, and I'll always associate that with my part of my life.
Right.
Um, I have like these rooting practices that keeps me really in line with my purpose. And I think it's so important that we sometimes have to do those practices, particularly as we're exploring new avenues and new teaching or educational or even outside of that endeavors. Um, and I was talking to one of my coworkers the other day because it's going along with this conversation of roots and like what is a driver behind you constantly coming back, you know?
Mm.
And I've realized for me it's actually like it's real care for the people I'm teaching. Real absolutely like care for wanting to better their circumstance. And for other people is different. Other people have a particular kind of teaching agenda or I won't even like say the array of different kind of motivations,
Right.
what it takes to go back, into our roots of educating myself. But like I intentionally, outside of just my these rooting practices I do before sessions, I currently during sessions also during lunch like talk about to my participants and sit down with them, ask them about their families, and ask them about like their own roots, and
Yeah.
um, I do research also beforehand about the different. So I was in I was in this like country in the UAE that's quite thriving right now economically, and I did a lot of reading about that country beforehand and trying to see from different perspectives, talking to cab drivers there, talking to working
Mm.
class people, talking to people in the government, which I was working in.
Yeah.
And that allowed me to build this natural sense of care and also like straight up knowledge about that society. So I can enter
Yeah.
these conversations, be rooted not only in my past experiences, but also be rooted in like the way I connect to people, which is like care and love, which just developed as a result of those conversations.
Yeah.
So
No.
it's
Wow.
people. I say at least the last thing I would say is be intentional about our rooting practices. We need
Hmm.
them
Hmm.
because, like me, I'm an air person. My
Yeah.
my head is sometimes really up here, and like the people that really root me outside of like my partner, my family, and like my friends are really like these experiences and like these things like love and
Yeah.
etc. Whatever it is to you or to person XYZ, find that and practice it.
Thank you. That was great. That was such a great answer for what are your roots. Maybe in part two, I'll ask you the same question and maybe you'll have a different answer then.
Right.
Okay, we'll end it right here for part one and then we'll be back for part two.
Great. That's good.